What was supposed to be a romantic first wedding anniversary became the day that changed everything. The moment my husband pushed me off Silver Mist Falls, I realized our entire marriage had been building to this betrayal. At the time, I lived with my husband Nathan in a charming brownstone in Boston's historic Beacon Hill neighborhood. From the outside, we seemed like the perfect couple. He was a successful investment banker, I was a rising curator at the Museum of Fine Arts, and our Instagram feed was filled with carefully curated moments of apparent happiness. But behind closed doors, our reality was starkly different. Nathan and I had met at a charity gala 3 years earlier, during the opening of a new contemporary art wing. I remember that night vividly. He stood out in the crowd, not just because of his striking appearance in a perfectly tailored navy suit, but because of how intently he listened to my passionate explanation of the exhibition's theme. He was charismatic, sophisticated, and seemed to understand me in a way no one else had before. When he asked for my number at the end of the evening, it felt like the beginning of something extraordinary. Those first few months were like living in a dream. Nathan swept me off my feet with his grand romantic gestures. Surprise weekend getaways to coastal Maine, handwritten love notes left on my pillow, elaborate home-cooked dinners when I worked late at the museum. He remembered every detail I mentioned in passing. My favorite flowers, purple hyacinths, my coffee order, oat milk latte with an extra shot, even the name of my childhood pet, a golden retriever named Scout. Looking back now, I can see how methodically he was constructing the perfect facade before revealing his true nature. Little by little, the dream began to crack. It started with subtle criticisms about my appearance, suggestions that my curly hair looked unprofessional for a museum curator, that my clothing choices were too attention-seeking for someone in a serious relationship. Then came the questions about my male colleagues, the constant checking of my phone, the way he would coincidentally show up at museum events unannounced. His charming smile would transform into cold fury if I spent too long talking to any man, even elderly, board members or longtime donors. The control escalated so gradually that I barely noticed how much of myself I was giving up. I started straightening my hair every morning to avoid his comments. I changed my work wardrobe to more conservative styles. I began declining after hours. Events at the museum, even though networking was crucial for my career. Eventually, I found myself constantly walking on eggshells, trying to predict and prevent his next outburst. Our wedding day, a year ago, should have been a warning sign. Nathan had insisted on handling all the arrangements himself, claiming he wanted to remove any stress from my shoulders. In reality, he orchestrated every detail without my input, from the venue to my dress to the guest list. I barely recognized myself in the wedding photos, my naturally curly hair chemically straightened, wearing a dress I would never have chosen. But I smiled through it all, telling myself this was what compromise in marriage looked like. So when Nathan suggested celebrating our first wedding anniversary with a weekend trip to Vermont's Silver Mist Falls, where he had first told me he loved me, I desperately wanted to believe it meant things could change, that maybe he was trying to recapture the magic of our early days together. The falls had been magical that first time. We'd hiked there on a crisp autumn day, and he'd pulled out a picnic of wine, cheese, and fresh bread from his backpack. Standing there with the mist creating rainbows in the sunlight, he'd looked into my eyes and told me I was his soulmate. Now, a year into our marriage, I couldn't help but hope this return to Silver Mist Falls meant he wanted to make things right. Perhaps he'd realized how controlling he'd become. Maybe he missed the woman I used to be, just as I did. I spent hours packing for the trip, carefully selecting clothes I thought he would approve of, while simultaneously dreaming of a reconciliation that would allow me to be myself again. I couldn't have been more wrong. The morning of our anniversary dawned crisp and clear, one of those perfect early autumn days that New England is famous for. I woke up early, my stomach in knots, both from anticipation and anxiety. Nathan was already up, meticulously packing the car. He had planned everything, down to the exact time we would leave to maximize daylight at the falls, as he put it. I watched him from our bedroom window as he loaded the trunk with military precision. Something about his movements seemed different that morning, more rigid, more calculated than usual. But I pushed the thought away, chalking it up to my own nerves about the weekend ahead. "Rebecca!" His sharp call made me jump. "We need to leave in exactly 20 minutes. Are you ready?" There was an edge to his voice that I recognized. The tone that meant he was already finding fault with something I'd done or hadn't done. I quickly grabbed my overnight bag, double-checking that I had packed everything he might expect. The conservative blue sweater he liked, the flat shoes he preferred I wear instead of heels, the minimal makeup he approved of. My hand brushed against something at the bottom of the bag. A small tube of bright red lipstick I'd impulsively bought last week, but hadn't dared to wear yet. For some reason, I left it there, feeling a tiny thrill of defiance. The first hour of the drive was tense with silence. Nathan gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, and he barely looked at me. When I tried to make conversation about the beautiful fall foliage, he merely grunted in response. I noticed he kept checking his phone whenever. He thought I wasn't looking, quickly putting it face down on his lap if I glanced his way. As we drove deeper into Vermont, leaving the main highways for smaller state roads, I felt increasingly uneasy. Nathan had insisted on taking what he called a scenic route to Silver Mist Falls, one I didn't remember from our previous visit. The roads became narrower, more winding, and the gaps between passing cars grew longer and longer. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I finally asked, trying to keep my voice light. "I don't remember coming this way last time." Nathan's response was immediate and sharp. "Are you questioning my ability to navigate? I know exactly where I'm going." His hand tightened on the steering wheel, and I saw that muscle in his jaw twitch, the warning sign I'd learned to fear. I fell silent again, watching the trees blur past my window. The gorgeous autumn colors that had delighted me earlier now seemed ominous, like flames licking at the edges of my vision. I tried to focus on my breathing, the way my therapist had taught me during those few secret sessions I'd managed to attend before Nathan found out and made me stop. Around noon, Nathan pulled into a small roadside diner. "We need to eat," he announced, as if it were his idea and not prompted by my stomach growling for the past hour. Inside, he ordered for both of us without consulting me. Black coffee and a plain turkey sandwich. No mayo, no cheese. "We need to watch your weight," he said, loud enough for the waitress to hear. I saw her eyes flicker between us, a flash of concern crossing her face before she hurried away. While we ate, I noticed Nathan checking his watch repeatedly. He seemed agitated, rushing through his meal and urging me to eat faster. "We need to reach the falls by exactly 2 o'clock, he insisted. "The light will be perfect then." Perfect for what? I wondered, but didn't dare ask. Back in the car, the tension continued to build. Nathan's phone buzzed several times, but he ignored it, even though I could see the same number calling repeatedly. When I asked if he needed to take the call, he snapped at me to mind my own business. As we got closer to Silver Mist Falls, the roads became even more remote. The cell service on my phone disappeared, and I watched the bars drop to 0 with a sinking feeling in my stomach. We hadn't passed another car for at least 30 minutes, and the only signs of civilization were occasional weather-beaten mailboxes at the end of long dirt driveways. Nathan's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He would accelerate suddenly, then brake hard for no apparent reason. His eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, even though there was no one behind us. When we passed a sign indicating Silver Mist Falls was just 5 miles ahead, I saw something change in his expression, a hardening of his features, a coldness in his eyes that made my blood run cold. I wanted to believe this trip would save our marriage, but sitting there in the suffocating silence of our car, watching my husband transform into someone I barely recognized, I couldn't ignore the voice in my head screaming that something was terribly, terribly wrong. When we finally pulled into the small gravel parking lot at Silver Mist Falls, the silence in the car had become almost unbearable. A light mist hung in the air, shrouding the surrounding pine trees in an ethereal haze. The lot was completely empty. No other cars, no ranger station, no signs of human life. Just wilderness stretching in every direction. Perfect, Nathan muttered, more to himself than to me. There was something unsettling about the way he said it, like he was checking off a box on some mental list. He parked the car at the furthest end of the lot, despite there being no other vehicles around. Another thing that didn't make sense. Another detail that made my skin crawl. "We should get started," he said, checking his watch again. "The trail gets dangerous when it's dark." It was only 2:15 p.m. and I knew sunset wasn't for hours, but I didn't question him. I'd learned that questioning Nathan only made things worse. As we started up the trail, I noticed how different everything felt from our first visit. Back then, we'd come on a busy weekend, passing other hikers every few minutes, exchanging friendly nods and greetings. Now, the trail was deserted, our footsteps muffled by a thick carpet of fallen leaves. The only sound was the distant roar of the falls, growing louder with each step. Nathan insisted on walking behind me, something he'd never done before. "I want to make sure you don't slip," he said, but his explanation felt hollow. Every time I tried to slow down or stop to catch my breath, he would press his hand against my lower back, urging me forward. The pressure of his touch made my heart race, and not in the way it used to. The trail grew steeper and narrower as we climbed. Through breaks in the trees, I could see glimpses of the valley below, the autumn colors creating a patchwork of reds and golds. It should have been beautiful, but all I could think about was how far we were from help, how completely alone we were out here. I noticed Nathan had brought a backpack, something I hadn't seen him pack in the car. When I asked what was in it, his response was sharp. "Anniversary supplies. Stop asking questions and keep walking." The way he said anniversary supplies made my blood run cold. As we neared the top of the falls, the mist grew thicker, making the rocky path slick and treacherous. I could feel my shoes losing traction on the wet stones. Nathan had insisted I wear these particular shoes, flat-soled canvas sneakers that I now realized offered almost no grip on the slippery surface. The main viewing platform came into view, a natural rock outcropping that jutted out over the falls. Last time we were here, there had been safety rails, but they appeared to have been removed, leaving nothing between the edge and the 100-foot drop to the rocks below. "Isn't this romantic?" Nathan's voice came from behind me, but there was something wrong with it. The tender tone he was trying to project didn't match the hardness in his eyes. "Just like our first time here." I tried to smile, to play along, but my face felt frozen. "The rails," I managed to say, "they're gone." "Park budget cuts," he replied too quickly, as if he'd anticipated the question. "Stand closer to the edge. I want to take your picture." My whole body screamed at me not to move, but I took a small step forward. The roar of the falls was deafening now, the spray making my clothes damp. Through the mist, I could see the jagged rocks at the base of the falls, the churning white water that could easily swallow a body without a trace. "Closer," Nathan instructed, reaching into his backpack. I expected him to pull out a camera. Instead, I caught a glimpse of something else, a stack of papers, documents. Whatever it was, he quickly shoved it back inside when he saw me looking. "You know," he said, taking a step toward me, "I've been thinking a lot about our marriage lately." His voice had changed again, becoming clinical, detached. It was the voice he used at work, not the voice of a husband speaking to his wife on their anniversary. I took a step backward, but my heel met empty air. I was already at the edge. Below, "Me!" the falls thundered, as if warning me of what was to come. Nathan's face had transformed entirely now. The mask of the charming, successful husband completely gone, replaced by something cold and calculating that I'd only caught glimpses of before. "Nathan," I whispered, but the wind and water swallowed my voice. In that moment, looking into his eyes, I knew with absolute certainty that he hadn't brought me here to celebrate our anniversary. He had brought me here to make me disappear. Time seemed to slow down as Nathan took another step toward me, his face a mask of cold determination. The mist from the falls swirled around us, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made everything feel like a nightmare. But this was real, terrifyingly, horrifyingly real. "You know, Rebecca," he said, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone that chilled me more than any shout could have. "Marriage is all about trust. And lately, I've been thinking about how much you've changed, those secret therapy sessions you thought I didn't know about, the way you've been documenting things in that little journal you keep in your desk at work, the photos you've been storing in a private cloud account." My heart stopped. He knew. Somehow, he had discovered my attempts to build a case, to create a record of his abuse. I had been so careful, but obviously not careful enough. Each word he spoke was another nail in what I suddenly realized was about to become my coffin. "I have to admit," he continued, taking another step closer, "you were smarter than I expected, but not smart enough." He reached into his backpack again and pulled out a stack of papers, printouts of my private emails, screenshots of text messages to my sister about his controlling behavior, even photos I had taken of bruises he'd left on my arms during his passionate moments. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" The facade of calm was cracking now, anger seeping through like poison. "Did you think you could just collect evidence against me? Build a case? Ruin everything I've worked for?" I tried to step sideways, to edge away from the precipice, but he moved with me, maintaining the deadly triangle between himself, me, and the 100-foot drop behind me. The roar of the falls seemed to grow louder, as if nature itself was screaming a warning. "Please," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We can talk about this. We can get help, go to counseling." His laugh cut through the air like a knife. "Counseling? So you can tell more strangers about our private life? So you can paint me as the villain?" He shook his head, and for a moment, I saw something like regret flash across his face. "You know, this isn't how I wanted things to end. But you've left me no choice." "Nathan, think about what you're doing," I pleaded, my mind racing for any way out of this situation. "People know we're here. They'll look for me. Will they?" His smile was terrible to behold. The caring husband, taking his wife on a romantic anniversary trip to their special place. Then, the tragic accident. My beloved Rebecca, always so clumsy in those flat shoes she insisted on wearing, slipping on the wet rocks despite my warnings to be careful. They'll find your body eventually, of course. These falls have claimed other lives before. The current is particularly treacherous this time of year. The methodical way he laid out my death made my blood run cold. This wasn't a sudden rage, a crime of passion. He had planned this meticulously, probably for weeks. The remote location, the removed safety rails, the shoes he'd insisted I wear. It had all been leading to this moment. "The insurance policy I took out on you last month will help me through my period of grief," he continued, almost thoughtfully. "Double indemnity for accidental death. Quite a substantial sum, actually. I should thank you for being so trusting, signing those papers, without reading them carefully." My mind flashed to the stack of documents he'd placed in front of me one evening, claiming they were routine updates to our financial planning. I had signed them without question, still believing then that keeping the peace was the key to fixing our marriage. "You won't get away with this," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew how hollow they sounded. He had thought of everything. Nathan's face hardened. "I already have." He took one final step toward me, his hands rising. "Goodbye, Rebecca. Thank you for making this so easy." In that split second before his hands made contact with my shoulders, time seemed to crystallize. I saw everything with perfect clarity. The cruel twist of his lips, the complete absence of humanity in his eyes, the calculated strength in his arms as he prepared to end my life. But I also saw something else, something that gave me a surge of desperate strength, my own reflection in his cold eyes, and I didn't recognize the fearful woman I had become. The impact of his hands against my shoulders was brutal, decisive. I felt myself falling backward, the world tilting crazily as the mist-filled air rushed around me. The last thing I heard before the roar of the falls consumed everything was Nathan's voice, eerily calm. "I'll tell everyone how hard I tried to grab you." Then I was falling, tumbling through space, the spray from the falls blinding me. The rational part of my brain knew these were probably my last moments alive. But something else, something deeper and more primal, screamed at me to fight. I wasn't going to let him win. I wasn't going to let this be my ending. The fall seemed to last forever and no time at all. As I plunged through the mist-filled air, time slowed to a crawl, and a strange clarity washed over me. In those endless seconds, a memory burst into my mind, something I hadn't thought about in years. I was 12 years old, at my aunt's lake house in Maine. My cousin had playfully pushed me off the dock, not knowing I couldn't swim. But my uncle, a former lifeguard, had taught me something vital that day after fishing me out. Water isn't your enemy unless you fight it. Let it guide you, then use its force to save yourself. That lesson from 20 years ago suddenly became my lifeline. Instead of flailing against the fall, I forced my body to streamline, trying to control my descent as much as possible. The freezing spray of the waterfall enveloped me, the roar becoming deafening. I could see the churning pool below growing closer through the mist, and I knew I had seconds to make decisions that would mean life or death. The impact with the water felt like hitting concrete. The cold shocked the air from my lungs, and the current immediately grabbed me, spinning me like a rag doll in a washing machine. The waterfall's force pushed me deep, disorienting me until I couldn't tell up from down. My lungs screamed for air, and panic clawed at the edges of my consciousness. But I refused to let it win. I refused to let Nathan win. Water isn't your enemy. My uncle's words echoed in my head. Instead of fighting the current, I let it carry me, waiting for the moment when its force would weaken. My burning lungs felt ready to burst, but I forced myself to stay calm. Fighting the water would only drain my precious remaining oxygen faster. Just when I thought I couldn't hold my breath any longer, I felt the current's grip loosen slightly. This was my chance. I kicked hard, aiming for what I hoped was the surface, praying I had enough strength left to make it. My vision was starting to darken around the edges when my head finally broke through into air. I gasped desperately, choking on a mixture of air and spray, but I was alive. The current was still strong, carrying me downstream, but it was no longer the violent force that had held me under. Through blurred vision, I could see the shoreline passing by, too fast, but at least it was visible. My waterlogged clothes tried to drag me under again, making every movement a struggle. I knew I had to get out of the water before hypothermia set in, but the banks on either side were steep and rocky. I needed to find a place where I could safely make it to shore. As I was carried downstream, I forced myself to stay alert, scanning the banks for any opportunity. My body was growing numb from the cold, and I knew I was running out of time. Then I saw it, a fallen tree extending partway into the river, creating a natural break in the current. Using the last reserves of my strength, I angled myself toward it, fighting against the pull of the water. My fingers, numb and clumsy, scraped against bark as I made my first grab for the tree. I missed, the current threatening to sweep me past my only chance at survival. With a desperate lunge, I tried again, and this time my hands found purchase on a sturdy branch. The effort of pulling myself along the tree trunk was excruciating. Every muscle screamed in protest, and my wet clothes felt like they weighed hundreds of pounds. But inch by inch, I dragged myself toward the bank, refusing to let go despite the shaking in my arms and the way my vision kept blurring. When I finally reached the shore, I collapsed onto the rocky bank, coughing up river water and shaking uncontrollably. I was alive, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. Nathan would expect the falls and the river to have done his work for him, but if he had any doubt, he might come looking downstream to make sure. I forced myself to crawl further up the bank, into the cover of the trees. Every movement sent waves of pain through my body. I could feel various cuts and bruises making themselves known, souvenirs from my impact with the water and the rocks I'd scraped against. But the pain was good. Pain meant I was alive, and alive meant I could fight back. Once under the shelter of the trees, I took stock of my situation. My phone was gone, along with my purse and everything else I'd had with me. My clothes were soaked and torn, offering little protection against the growing chill in the air. I had no idea how far the current had carried me or where the nearest road might be. And somewhere up there, my husband thought he had just murdered me. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat, which I quickly suppressed. I couldn't afford to fall apart now. I needed to think clearly, to make decisions that would keep me alive and give me a chance to expose Nathan for what he really was. As I huddled beneath the trees, shivering violently in my soaked clothes, I forced myself to think strategically. The old Rebecca, the one who had lived in fear of Nathan's moods and temper, would have been paralyzed by panic. But nearly dying has a way of changing you. Each chattering breath I took was a reminder. I had survived his worst attempt to destroy me. Now I needed to survive what came next. First priority was getting warm and finding help. The sun was still up, but I could feel the temperature dropping as afternoon crept toward evening. If I didn't find shelter soon, hypothermia would finish what Nathan had started. I knew I had to keep moving, but which direction? The river had carried me downstream, so logically, civilization would be more likely in that direction. Following. The water might lead to a town or at least a road. Using a tree trunk for support, I pulled myself to my feet. Every muscle protested, and my head spun alarmingly. When my vision cleared, I noticed blood trickling down my arm from a deep gash. I hadn't even felt in the chaos of survival. I tore a strip from my already ruined blouse to create a makeshift bandage. The cut would need proper medical attention eventually, but for now, stopping the bleeding was enough. As I began walking parallel to the river, staying within the tree, line for cover, my mind raced through the implications of what had just happened. Nathan would be playing the part of the devastated husband by now, probably having already called the police to report my tragic accident. I could imagine his performance, the perfect mix of grief and shock, telling them how he had tried to save me but couldn't reach me in time. He had always been an excellent actor. The rough ground beneath my feet was torture in my waterlogged shoes, but I forced myself to keep moving. Each step sent jolts of pain through my battered body, but each step was also taking me further from the falls, further from Nathan, and closer to potential help. I tried to focus on the practical rather than the overwhelming emotions threatening to surface. One foot in front of the other, keep the river in sight, listen for cars or any signs of civilization. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, I heard something that made my heart leap. The distant sound of vehicles. A road. It had to be a road. I altered my course toward the noise, though every survival instinct screamed at me to stay hidden in the trees. What if Nathan was already driving the roads, looking to confirm his murderous mission had succeeded? The sound grew louder as I approached, and eventually I could see breaks in the trees revealing what appeared to be a rural highway. I stayed hidden, watching the occasional car pass by. Each vehicle made me flinch, expecting to see Nathan's black BMW, but they were all unfamiliar. Still, I waited and watched, gathering my courage and forming a plan. I needed help, but I had to be careful about how I got it. If I went to the police immediately, it would be my word against Nathan's. He would have already established his version of events, the tragic accident, the grieving husband. Without evidence, without preparation, I might not be believed. After all, he was a respected investment banker, and I was about to sound like a hysterical, paranoid woman. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to disappear long enough to gather evidence, to build a case that would expose Nathan for what he really was. But first, I needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere he wouldn't think to look for me. A truck was approaching, an old pickup that had seen better days. I could see a single occupant in the cab, an elderly man. Something about his weathered face reminded me of my grandfather, and in that moment, I made my decision. I stepped out of the trees, waving my arms to flag him down. The truck slowed to a stop, and the old man's eyes widened as he took in my appearance, soaked, bloody, probably looking half dead. "Good Lord, miss, what happened to you?" I had seconds to decide how much to tell him. The whole truth would sound crazy, might make him hesitant to help. "I fell," I said, my voice hoarse, "near the falls. I need to get to the nearest town, please. I'll pay you once I can contact my family." He was already opening the passenger door. "Don't worry about payment. You need a hospital, by the looks of it." I shook my head as I climbed in. "No hospitals. Not yet. Just the nearest town. Please." The old man introduced himself as Earl, and thankfully, he didn't push for more details about my condition. As his truck rumbled down the winding Vermont roads, I learned we were heading toward a small town called Miller's Creek. The name meant nothing to me, which was perfect. It would mean nothing to Nathan either. Earl kept glancing at me with concern, probably noting how badly I was shaking despite the truck's heater running full blast. "My wife Martha's about your size," he said finally. "Let me take you to our place first, get you some dry clothes, maybe some hot coffee. Then we can figure out your next move." Every instinct I'd developed during my marriage screamed that I shouldn't trust anyone, that accepting help made me vulnerable. But I couldn't do this alone. Looking at Earl's weathered face, the genuine concern in his eyes, I made another decision that felt like stepping off the edge of those falls. I decided to trust. "Thank you," I managed through chattering teeth. "I'd appreciate that." "Earl." And Martha's house was a small farmhouse, set back from the road, surrounded by apple trees heavy with fruit. Martha took one look at me standing in her kitchen and switched instantly into caretaking mode. Within 30 minutes, I was wrapped in warm, dry clothes, holding a mug of hot coffee, while Martha tended to my cuts with supplies from an ancient first aid kit. "You don't have to tell us what happened," Martha said softly as she cleaned the gash on my arm. "But if someone did this to you, we know people who can help. The women's shelter in Burlington—" "I can't," I cut her off. Then, softened my tone. "Not yet. I need to be smarter this time." Martha and Earl exchanged a look that spoke volumes about their understanding of my situation. "Well," Martha said, "you can stay here tonight at least. Get your bearings." That night, lying in their spare bedroom, I began to form a plan. I needed to disappear completely. No credit cards, no phone, no electronic trail for Nathan to follow. But I also needed to gather evidence, build a case that would be impossible to dismiss. And I needed help from someone Nathan didn't know about, someone he couldn't trace back to me. My thoughts went to my college roommate, Sophie. We hadn't spoken in over a year, one of many friendships Nathan had systematically isolated me from. But before that, we'd been like sisters. She now lived in Seattle, about as far from Boston as you could get while staying in the continental U.S. More importantly, she was a lawyer specializing in domestic violence cases. The next morning, Martha let me use their landline. My hands shook as I dialed Sophie's number from memory, praying it hadn't changed. When I heard her voice, something inside me cracked. "Sophie," I whispered. "It's Rebecca. I need your help. Nathan tried to kill me." The silence on the other end lasted only a second before Sophie's lawyer mode kicked in. "Are you safe right now? Where are you?" "I'm safe for the moment. But I need to disappear for a while. I need to do this right." "Listen carefully," Sophie said, her voice steady and determined. "I'm going to help you, but we need to be strategic. Nathan will be watching everything. Your bank accounts, credit cards, phone records, email. We need to make him believe he succeeded." Over the next hour, Sophie laid out a plan. She would fly to Vermont with cash and a prepaid phone, meeting me at a predetermined location. She had connections with a network of domestic violence survivors who could help me stay off the grid while we built my case. "The most important thing right now," Sophie emphasized, "is to let Nathan think he won. Let him play the grieving husband. Let him think he's safe. Meanwhile, we'll document everything, build an airtight case. We'll need medical records of your injuries from today, statements from Earl and Martha about your condition when they found you, any evidence you have of past abuse." "I have documentation," I told her, "hidden in a safety deposit box at a bank in Boston. Photos, emails, journal entries, things Nathan doesn't know about." "Good," Sophie said. "That's good, but don't try to access it yet. Nathan will be watching those kinds of things. I'll have someone trustworthy retrieve it when the time is right." After hanging up, I sat at Martha's kitchen table, my mind racing. For the first time since Nathan's hands had pushed me toward what should have been my death, I felt something other than fear. I felt purpose, determination, and something else, a burning desire for justice. Martha set a plate of eggs in front of me, her face full of motherly concern. "Whatever you're planning, you need your strength," she said simply. Looking at this kind woman who had taken in a half-drowned stranger, I made a decision. "I need to tell you the whole story," I said. "I need witnesses who know the truth." Sitting at Martha's worn kitchen table, the words began to pour out of me. I told them everything, how I'd met Nathan at the museum gala, how charming and perfect he'd seemed at first, how gradually the control and abuse had escalated. I described the isolation, the manipulation, the careful way he'd stripped away my independence piece by piece. Finally, I told them about the falls, about the cold calculation in his eyes as he'd pushed me to what should have been my death. Martha held my hand throughout the story, while Earl sat silently, his weathered face growing stormier with each detail. When I finished, he stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at his apple orchard as if it could provide answers. "I'm writing every word of this down," Martha said firmly, pulling out a notebook from a kitchen drawer. "Dates, times, details, everything you can remember. This is your first official statement, Rebecca. We'll have it notarized in town." The methodical way she approached it, like she'd done this before, made me pause. "You've helped others, haven't you?" Martha and Earl shared another of their meaningful looks. "Let's just say you're not the first woman who's needed a safe harbor in this house," Martha said softly. "Though you're the first who's survived something quite like this." For the next 2 hours, we documented everything. Martha's questions were precise, helping me remember details I hadn't even realized I'd noticed. The exact time Nathan had checked his watch before the push, the documents I'd glimpsed in his backpack, the specific words he'd used. Every detail could be crucial later. Around noon, Sophie called back on the landline. "I've booked a flight to Burlington under an alias," she said. "I'll be there tonight." "But Rebecca, you need to know. Nathan's already made his move. You're all over the local news in Boston. Tragic accident at Vermont Waterfall claims life of museum curator. He's playing his part perfectly." My hands started shaking again, but this time with anger rather than fear. Let me guess. He's devastated, cooperating with authorities. The grieving husband? Exactly. He's already given tearful interviews about how he tried to save you. Says he reached for you but couldn't grab you in time. Claims you were taking photos and slipped. The calculated nature of it all made me feel sick, but it also strengthened my resolve. He thinks he's won. That's good. Let him think that. Let him think he's gotten away with it. Sophie outlined the next steps. She'd arrive with cash, clean phones, and new identification documents through her domestic violence support network. We'd need to move. Quickly, Martha and Earl's place, while safe for now, was too close to the falls. Nathan might think to check nearby properties if no body was found. What about your sister? Sophie asked. Do you want to let her know you're alive? I thought about my sister Kate, imagining her grief right now, and my heart ached. But I remembered how Nathan had mentioned my private cloud account right before pushing me. He'd been monitoring my communications probably for months. No, I said reluctantly. Kate wears her heart on her sleeve. She wouldn't be able to hide it if she knew I was alive. We have to let her grieve for now. It's safer that way. Earl, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. I've got a fishing cabin up in Maine, he said. Hasn't been used in years. It's remote, but livable. No one would think to look for you there. The offer touched me deeply, but I shook my head. I can't put you at risk like that. If Nathan somehow traces me here. Let me stop you right there, Earl interrupted, his voice firm. That man already thinks he's committed murder. If he finds out we helped you, what's he going to do? Kill us too? Make it look like another accident? The more people who know the truth, the safer everyone is. Martha nodded in agreement. Earl's right. The cabin is perfect for now. It'll give you time to heal, to plan your next steps. Sophie can help you build your legal case from there. As we discussed the logistics, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. Less than 24 hours ago, I had been falling through the air, certain I was about to die. Now I was building a network of allies, planning my resurrection, and Nathan's downfall. There's one more thing, Martha said, disappearing into another room. She returned with a small digital camera. We need to document your injuries while they're fresh. The bruises from his hands on your shoulders, the cuts, everything. Medical evidence is crucial. As Martha photographed my injuries, I thought about Nathan sitting in our Boston brownstone right now, probably rehearsing his grief for the next news camera. He'd always been so careful before, never leaving marks where people could see them, always maintaining his perfect image. But in what he thought was his final act of violence against me, he'd finally gotten sloppy. The bruises blooming on my shoulders were in the perfect shape of his hands. Sophie arrived just after sunset, having rented a nondescript car in Burlington under a false name. When she saw me, she froze for a moment, then rushed forward to embrace me, careful of my injuries. I knew you were strong, she whispered. But, you're incredible, Rebecca. You're the first person I know who's survived something like this. We gathered around Martha's kitchen table, where Sophie laid out everything she'd brought. A prepaid phone, $5,000 in cash, a temporary ID under the name Sarah Mitchell, and dark hair dye. Your picture's everywhere in New England, she explained. We need to change your appearance. Martha took charge of the hair transformation in her bathroom, turning my distinctive blonde hair into a deep chestnut brown. As I stared at my reflection, the bruises on my face contrasting sharply with my newly dark hair, I hardly recognized myself. But maybe that was appropriate. I didn't feel like the same person anymore either. I've contacted a domestic violence survivors network, Sophie said as Martha worked. They're helping us establish a paper trail for Sarah Mitchell. It needs to be bulletproof. Nathan has resources and he'll look for you if he suspects you survived. Tell me what he's doing, I said, needing to know what we were up against. Sophie pulled out her tablet, showing me news coverage from Boston. There was Nathan, looking appropriately devastated, his voice breaking as he described our perfect marriage and the tragic accident that had taken his beloved wife. He'd even mentioned our fertility struggles, a complete fabrication, to explain why we'd been at the falls, claiming we'd been seeking a spiritual place to heal after a recent miscarriage. "He's good," Sophie admitted, watching my face. "But he's also getting cocky. He did 3 interviews today alone. The more he talks, the more details he adds to his story. And details can be checked, can contradict each other. He's leaving us. Breadcrumbs without realizing it." Earl's cabin in Maine became our immediate plan. It was remote enough to be safe, but close enough for Sophie to visit regularly as we built our case. The cabin had no internet, no landline, nothing that could be traced. Perfect for a ghost. "What about my job? My life in Boston?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Rebecca Phillips is dead," Sophie said gently. "She has to stay. That way until we're ready." Sarah Mitchell, however, is a freelance writer working on her first novel. She values her privacy and pays for everything in cash. The Survivors Network has already started establishing her background, school records, work history, everything. As midnight approached, Martha insisted we all try to get some sleep. Tomorrow would be an early start. Earl would drive me to the cabin in his truck while Sophie followed at a distance, watching for any signs we were being followed. Lying in the spare bedroom for the last time, I thought about Nathan sitting in our bedroom in Boston. Was he sleeping peacefully, believing he'd gotten away with murder? Or was he lying awake, planning his next moves, crafting his grieving husband persona? I touched my newly dark hair, still damp from the dye. The woman Nathan had tried to kill, the agreeable, accommodating Rebecca who lived in fear of his moods, was indeed dead. But like a phoenix rising from the ashes, someone new was emerging, someone stronger, someone who would make him pay for every bruise, every manipulation, every moment of fear. Early the next morning, before the sun rose, I hugged Martha tightly. This woman had taken in a half-drowned stranger and helped transform her into someone who had a fighting chance. "Thank you," I whispered, "for everything." "You stay strong," she replied, pressing a small package into my hands. "I made some of those molasses cookies you liked, and I added my special ingredient. Justice takes time to bake properly, just like cookies." Earl's truck rumbled to life in the pre-dawn darkness. As we pulled away from the farmhouse, Sophie following discreetly in her rental car, I watched Martha's figure grow smaller in the side mirror. She stood on the porch until we were out of sight, a steadfast guardian angel in a flannel robe. The drive to Maine would take several hours, giving me time to start learning to think of myself as Sarah Mitchell. I needed to practice her signature, memorize her background story, learn to answer to her name without hesitation. One slip could betray me. "You know," Earl said after we'd been driving for about an hour, "I was in law enforcement for 30 years before retiring to grow apples. Saw a lot of cases like yours, though none quite this extreme. The ones who got away, who survived. They were always the ones who got angry instead of staying scared. I see that anger in you now." I looked at my reflection in the truck's side mirror, the dark hair, the determination in my eyes, the bruises that were evidence of Nathan's final mistake. "Good," I said firmly, "because angry is exactly what I am." Earl's cabin was more remote than I'd imagined, situated at the end of a winding dirt road that seemed to disappear into the Maine wilderness. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the closest town was a 30-minute drive. As we pulled up to the weathered structure, I realized this isolation, which might have terrified me a few days ago, now felt like a shield. "It's not much," Earl said, cutting the engine, "but it's sturdy. Got a good wood stove, clean well water, and solar panels I installed last summer. Basic internet connection through satellite, but Sophie says we shouldn't use that except in emergencies." Sophie pulled up in her rental car, immediately doing a perimeter check. a habit from her years of helping domestic violence survivors. The cabin sat on a small rise, giving clear views of the approaching road. Dense forest surrounded the other three sides, with a small stream running behind the property. It was, as Earl had promised, perfectly secluded. Inside, the cabin was basic but clean. A main room combined living area and kitchen, 2 small bedrooms. Branched off one side, and a surprisingly modern bathroom had been added recently. Earl's law enforcement background showed in the security features: reinforced doors, windows with multiple locks, and a gun safe bolted to the floor. "I'm leaving." "You this?" he said, opening the safe and pulling out a shotgun. "I'll show you how to use it properly before I leave. Hope you never need it, but better to have it and not need it." Sophie was already setting up what she called my war room in the second bedroom: a corkboard for timeline planning, a secure laptop not connected to any network, and files. She'd begun preparing. "We document everything," she explained. "Every interview Nathan gives, every statement to the police, every public appearance. People who lie eventually contradict themselves. We'll be ready when he does." For the next few hours, they taught me how to live as a ghost. The prepaid phone was for emergencies only, and even then, never direct calls. Specific sequences of rings at specific times would signal different messages. The laptop would be for writing everything down, but never connected to the internet. If I needed to communicate with Sophie, we'd use dead drops at specific locations. "The first few weeks are crucial," Sophie explained. "Nathan will be watching for any sign you survived. One mistake, one credit card transaction, one phone call, one sighting by the wrong person, and everything falls apart. You need to disappear completely." Earl spent time teaching me about the cabin's security, which floorboards creaked, useful for hearing intruders, which windows offered the best escape routes, how to work the generator in an emergency. He showed me how to handle the shotgun, making me practice until I could load and aim it confidently. "Remember," he said gravely, "if you ever need to use this, you shoot to stop. Center mass, no hesitation. Your life might depend on it." As evening approached, it was time for them to leave. Sophie would return in a week with supplies and any news we needed to document. Earl would check in periodically, his fishing hobby providing a perfect cover for his visits. "One more thing," Sophie said, pulling out a burner phone different from the emergency one she'd given me. "I'm meeting with a detective I trust in Boston next week. He's worked domestic violence cases for years, knows how manipulative abusers can be. I'm going to plant seeds of doubt about Nathan's story, get him looking deeper into the case. This phone is for direct communication with him once we're ready to move." After they left, I stood on the cabin's small porch, listening to the sounds of their vehicles fade away. The main forest was different from the manicured world I'd left behind in Boston, wilder, more honest somehow. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. Somewhere in the trees, an owl called out. Going back inside, I locked every door and window, checked every security measure Earl had shown me. Then I sat down at the laptop and began to write. Everything needed to be documented, not just Nathan's abuse and murder attempt, but every detail I could remember about our life together. Bank accounts, business associates, conversations I'd overheard, parties we'd attended. Anything might prove useful. As I typed, I remembered something Nathan had once said at a charity gala, drunk on expensive wine and his own sense of superiority. The beautiful thing about the financial world is that everything leaves a trace, if you know where to look. He'd been talking about tracking down tax evaders, but the principle would work against him too. Money always leaves a trail. I opened a new document and began listing every financial detail I could remember. Account numbers, investment firms, properties, even the names of his offshore accounts that he thought I didn't know about. Nathan had always treated me like I was stupid, assuming I wasn't paying attention when he discussed business. That had been his mistake. That first week in the cabin established a rhythm to my new life as Sarah Mitchell. During the day, I documented everything I could remember about my life with Nathan, creating detailed timelines and connecting seemingly unrelated events. At night, I practiced being someone new, changing my handwriting, my posture, even the way I spoke. Sarah Mitchell was more confident than Rebecca Phillips had ever been allowed to be. Sophie's first weekly visit brought news that made my blood run cold. "The search teams haven't found your body," she reported, spreading out newspaper clippings on the kitchen table. "Nathan's getting nervous. He's hired a private search team, making a big show of his determination to bring his beloved wife home for proper burial." "He's worried," I said, studying the photos of Nathan with the search team. Even through the grainy newspaper images, I could see the tension in his jaw, the slight furrow in his brow that always appeared when things weren't going according to his plan. "He needs a body to make this perfect." Sophie nodded. "And that's not all. My contact in the Boston PD, Detective Rivera, has been quietly looking into Nathan's background. The timing of that life insurance policy he took out on you raised some red flags. Plus, there's something odd about his financial records from the past few months. This caught my attention." "What kind of oddities?" "Large transfers to offshore accounts, properties being sold quickly below market value, investments being liquidated. It's like he's preparing for something bigger than just your accident." I moved to the corkboard where I'd been mapping everything out. "Look at this," I said, pointing to a series of dates. 3 months ago, Nathan started insisting I accompany him to all his business dinners. He'd never wanted that before. In fact, he used to get angry if I showed too much interest in his work. But suddenly, he wanted me there, meeting all his important clients. Sophie's eyes narrowed. "Setting up witnesses to testify to your happy marriage." "Exactly. But what if it was more than that?" I pulled out my laptop, opening the document where I'd been noting Nathan's financial dealings. Each of those dinners was with clients who had massive investment portfolios with his firm. And within weeks of each dinner, those clients started moving their money around in unusual ways. Sophie leaned in, her lawyer's instincts engaged. "You think he's running some kind of investment scam?" "Nathan always said the best time to hide suspicious financial activity is during periods of personal crisis or tragedy. What better cover than the tragic death of his wife? While everyone's focused on the grieving widower, who's going to look too closely at his clients' accounts." We spent the next several hours going through my notes, connecting dates and names. A pattern began to emerge, one that suggested Nathan's attempt to kill me might have been part of a larger scheme. "We need to be careful with this," Sophie warned. "If we're right, we're not just dealing with domestic violence anymore. Financial fraud at this level means serious money, possibly serious connections. Nathan might not be working alone." As if to emphasize her point, she showed me more recent photos from Boston newspapers. Nathan at my memorial service, surrounded by his business partners and clients. I recognized many of them, men and women who had dined in our home, who had smiled, and chatted with me at charity events, never noticing or choosing not to see the signs of abuse. "Look at their faces," I said, studying the photos. "They're watching Nathan, not the ceremony. They're waiting to see if he'll play his part correctly." Sophie took the photos back, sliding them into her briefcase. "I'll get these to Detective Rivera. He can start pulling financial records, but quietly. We don't want to spook Nathan or his associates yet." Before leaving, Sophie helped me dye my hair again, keeping up the dark color that helped disguise me. As she worked, she told me about the growing doubts in Boston about Nathan's story. "Your sister Kate isn't buying the accident narrative," she said. "She's been asking questions, pointing out inconsistencies in Nathan's version of events. And some of your former colleagues at the museum have come forward mentioning how your personality changed after marriage, how Nathan would show up unannounced at work." My heart ached thinking of Kate, but her skepticism didn't surprise me. We'd always been able to read each other, even when we weren't speaking directly. "Is she safe?" I asked. "I've got someone watching her just in case. But Nathan's too smart to do anything obvious right now. He needs to maintain his grieving widower image." After Sophie left, I stood at the cabin window, watching the main forest fade into twilight. Somewhere out there, Nathan was probably raising a glass of expensive wine, toasting his success. He thought he had orchestrated the perfect crime, a tragic accident that would not only eliminate his inconvenient wife, but provide cover for whatever financial scheme he was running. But he had made a crucial mistake. He had underestimated me, just as he always had. And now, with every piece of evidence we gathered, every connection we made, his perfect plan was beginning to unravel. 3 weeks into my new life as Sarah Mitchell, the first real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sophie arrived at the cabin earlier than her usual weekly visit, clutching a laptop and wearing an expression that told me something significant had happened. One of Nathan's junior associates at the firm reached out to Detective Rivera, she announced, setting up her laptop on the kitchen table. A woman named Megan Chen. She's been documenting irregularities in client accounts for months, but was too afraid to come forward. Your death changed that. I remembered Megan, a quiet, efficient woman who had started at the firm about 6 months ago. Nathan had dismissed her at dinner parties as just a numbers girl. But I'd noticed how observant she was, how little seemed to escape her attention. "She kept copies," Sophie continued, pulling up files on her laptop. "Transaction records, client meetings, everything. And here's the interesting part. She has recordings." My heart started racing. "Recordings of what?" "Nathan, in his office. Apparently, after you died, he became less careful about closing his door during certain conversations. Listen to this." Sophie played an audio file. Nathan's voice filled the cabin, along with another man I recognized as Thomas Whitman, one of his senior partners. They were discussing what they called the transition, moving client funds through a series of offshore accounts in the wake of my death. "The grieving widower angle is perfect," Whitman was saying. "No one looks too closely at a man in mourning, but we need to move faster. Some of these clients are getting antsy." "Everything's under control," Nathan replied, his voice carrying that smooth confidence I knew so well. "The police have officially ruled it an accident. No body yet, but that works in our favor. Keeps the story in the news, keeps sympathy high. Trust me, Tom. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, the money will be long gone and we'll be untouchable." Sophie stopped the recording. "There's more. Megan has dozens of these, plus documentation showing systematic fraud going back at least a year. Nathan and his partners have been using client funds for personal investments, covering their tracks with fake returns and manipulated statements." "And my death was supposed to be the perfect distraction," I said, the pieces falling into place. While everyone focused on the tragic accident and the grieving husband, they could finish their scheme and disappear with the money. Exactly. But Megan's evidence changes everything. Detective Rivera is building a case, but he has to move carefully. These men have connections, influence. One wrong move and they could vanish with millions of their clients' money. I moved to my corkboard, adding this new information to our growing web of evidence. "What about Megan? Is she safe?" "Rivera has her in protective custody. Nathan may play the refined investment banker, but we both know what he's capable of when threatened." Looking at the board, at the complex pattern of financial fraud we were uncovering, I felt a chill. How many other women had Nathan charmed, married, abused, and possibly planned to eliminate? Had I been the first, or just the first to survive? "There's something else," Sophie said, pulling out a manila envelope. Megan found these in Nathan's personal files. They're photographs of other women. The photos showed 3 women, all bearing a striking resemblance to me, blonde, professional, independent. Sophie had done background checks. One had died in a hiking accident 2 years before I met Nathan. Another had disappeared during a solo sailing trip off the coast of Maine. The third had apparently committed suicide, but her body had never been found. "We can't prove anything," Sophie cautioned, seeing my face. "But Rivera's reopening these cases. The pattern is too similar to ignore." I sat heavily in a kitchen chair, my mind reeling. The man I'd married wasn't just an abuser or a fraudster. He was potentially a serial killer, using his charm and position to target successful women, using their deaths to cover his financial schemes. "We need to move faster," I said, standing up and moving to the corkboard again. "Every day we wait is another day he has to finish his plan and disappear. And if we're right about these other women, we move too fast. We risk everything," Sophie reminded me. "Nathan's smart, connected, and now we know he's done this before. We need an airtight case." She was right, but sitting in this cabin, safe but hidden, while Nathan continued to play the grieving widower, was becoming increasingly difficult. Each news photo of him laying flowers at the falls, each sympathetic interview about his devastating loss, made my blood boil. But I had something the other women hadn't had. I was alive, I had evidence, and I had allies. Nathan's perfect plan had finally hit a snag, and that snag was going to unravel everything he'd built. A month into my hidden life at the cabin, the evidence against Nathan was mounting faster than we'd anticipated. Detective Rivera, working carefully to avoid tipping our hand, had uncovered a pattern of suspicious deaths stretching back nearly a decade. Each case involved a professional woman who had married into wealth. Each death had been ruled accidental or suicide, and each had been followed by large-scale financial movements through their husbands' business dealings. "It's like watching the same play with different actresses," Sophie said during one of our strategy sessions. She spread out files across my kitchen table: photographs, police reports, financial records. "The pattern is almost exactly the same every time. Whirlwind romance, lavish wedding, gradual isolation, then a tragic accident that somehow benefits his financial schemes." I studied the faces of the women who had come before me. Elizabeth Carter, the hiker who had slipped on a mountain trail. Maria Suarez, lost at sea during what was supposed to be a romantic sailing weekend. Jennifer Walsh, who had supposedly jumped from a bridge, though her body was never recovered. "He's refined his method," I noted, comparing the cases. "Each death looks more convincing than the last. By the time he got to me, he had it down to a science. The perfect location, the careful setup, even the grief performance afterward." Sophie nodded grimly. "That's what makes this so crucial. You're not just his only survivor. You're his biggest mistake. He thought he had perfected his technique, got cocky, and finally slipped up." Megan Chen's evidence had proved invaluable. Working with Detective Rivera, she had mapped out an intricate network of fraudulent investments and hidden accounts. Nathan and his partners had been systematically stealing from their clients for years, using the chaos and sympathy surrounding each tragic death to cover their tracks. "The problem is," Sophie explained, "we're racing against time. Nathan's getting ready to make his move. According to Megan, he's been liquidating assets, setting up new offshore accounts. He's planning to disappear soon, probably with millions in stolen client funds." I moved to my evidence board, where red string connected photographs, documents, and timeline entries. "Then we need to force his hand, make him reveal himself." "That's incredibly dangerous," Sophie warned. "If he even suspects you're alive, he'll panic," I finished. "And men like Nathan make mistakes when they panic. Look at his pattern. He maintains perfect control until something threatens his plan. Then he overreacts, gets sloppy." I pointed to the police report from Maria Suarez's case. "Here, when Maria's brother started asking too many questions, Nathan rushed her sailing accident, didn't wait for ideal weather conditions. And Jennifer Walsh, he moved too quickly because she was starting to document his abuse. Didn't plan for witnesses who saw her on the bridge. Sophie studied the reports thoughtfully. So, what are you suggesting? We need to shake his confidence, make him think his perfect plan isn't so perfect after all, but subtly, not enough to make him run, just enough to make him nervous. Over the next hour, we crafted a strategy. Detective Rivera would begin asking pointed questions about Nathan's financial dealings, while carefully avoiding any suggestion that he doubted the accident narrative. Meanwhile, Megan would ensure certain discrepancies in the client accounts became just visible enough to require explanation. The key, I explained, is to threaten his money, not his freedom, at least at first. Nathan's confident he can talk his way out of any suspicion about my death. But threaten his financial empire? That's where he'll start to crack. Sophie was typing notes rapidly on her laptop. We'll need to coordinate carefully. One wrong move, and he could vanish with everything. That's why we need one more piece, I said, pulling out a file I'd been building. We need to contact the families of the other women. Not directly. We can't risk word getting back to Nathan. But, through Rivera, if we can get their cases reopened, create pressure from multiple directions. He'll feel trapped, Sophie finished, catching my strategy. And a trapped Nathan is a Nathan who'll make mistakes. Looking at my reflection in the cabin window, my now dark hair, the determination in my eyes that had replaced the fear I'd lived with for so long, I felt a surge of pure resolve. Nathan had thought he was writing the final chapter of my story, but instead, he had only set in motion his own downfall. There's one more thing, I said, turning back to Sophie. I want to make sure the other families get justice too. Not just for their loved ones, but for every woman Nathan might target in the future if we don't stop him now. Sophie reached across the table and squeezed my hand. We'll get him, Rebecca. He thinks he's untouchable, but he's never faced anything. Like this. A survivor who knows all his secrets, working with people he doesn't even know exist. His perfect world is about to shatter, piece by piece. Our plan to pressure Nathan began with something subtle, a routine audit request from the State Financial Oversight Board. Detective Rivera had contacts who could make it happen without raising suspicion. It was the kind of bureaucratic nuisance that Nathan would normally handle with his usual charm and carefully prepared documentation. But this audit was different. The questions were just a little too specific. The documentation requirements just a little too detailed. And it came at exactly the moment when Nathan was trying to move the final pieces of his scheme into place. He's starting to sweat, Sophie reported during her weekly visit, showing me surveillance photos taken outside his office. Look at his face in these. This is not a man at peace with himself. The pictures showed Nathan leaving work, his normally impeccable appearance showing signs of strain. His tie was slightly askew, his characteristic confident stride replaced by something more hurried. In one photo, he was checking over his shoulder, a gesture I knew well from our marriage, the look of a man who feels watched. Megan says, "He's been staying late at the office," Sophie continued, shredding documents, making late-night calls to the Cayman Islands. He's trying to cover his tracks, but he's rushing now, making mistakes. The pressure increased when Detective Rivera arranged for a local news station to run a story about unsolved deaths in the financial sector. The report never mentioned Nathan directly, but it discussed patterns of suspicious accidents and disappearances involving wealthy investors' wives. The reporter even interviewed Maria Suarez's brother, who spoke passionately about his sister's death and his ongoing search for answers. Nathan called the station demanding they take the story down, Sophie said with grim satisfaction. Claimed it was causing him emotional distress by reminding him of his own tragic loss. But all he did was draw more attention to himself. Now, other stations are picking up the story. I watched the news clip on Sophie's laptop, feeling a mix of emotions as they showed my photograph, describing me as Nathan's most recent loss. The reporter mentioned the ongoing search for my body, noting that Nathan had personally funded extensive recovery efforts. He's still searching the river, I noted. That's interesting. He must be terrified they'll never find a body, a missing. Body means an open case, Sophie nodded. Rivera says he's becoming obsessed with it. Calls the search team daily, demands updates. He's even hired diving experts to explore some of the deeper pools downstream. Because a missing body could come back to haunt him? I said, understanding Nathan's desperation. Like I am, right now. Our next move was bolder. Using information from Megan's files, Detective Rivera began quietly contacting some of Nathan's largest clients. He couldn't tell them their investments might be fraudulent, not yet. But he could ask seemingly routine questions about their accounts, plant seeds of doubt that would lead them to start asking their own questions. The effect was immediate. Within days, several major clients were demanding emergency meetings, asking to see their full financial records. Nathan's carefully constructed investment scheme began to show signs of stress. He had 3 client meetings today, Sophie reported, reading from Megan's latest update. All of them demanded complete audits of their accounts. He's running out of excuses, running out of ways to hide the missing money. I studied the latest surveillance photos, seeing the increasing strain in Nathan's face. The polished facade was cracking. The confident stride was now a nervous scurry. He'd lost weight, and in one photo, I noticed his hands shaking as he reached for his car door. What about the other families? I asked. Have you made contact? Sophie pulled out a new file. Rivera has spoken with Elizabeth Carter's parents and Jennifer Walsh's sister. They've all had the same suspicions for years but couldn't prove anything. Now they're filing formal requests to reopen the cases. The pressure was building from all sides: financial regulators, clients, police, and the families of his previous victims. Nathan's perfect world was beginning to crumble, piece by carefully orchestrated piece. There's something else, Sophie said, her expression serious. Nathan started asking questions about Earl and Martha. He's hired a private investigator to look into everyone who lives near the falls. I think he's starting to wonder if someone might have helped you that day. My blood ran cold. Are they safe? Rivera's got people watching their farm, but this is good, actually. It means Nathan's starting to doubt himself, starting to wonder if his perfect murder wasn't so perfect after all. I walked to the cabin, window, looking out at the main forest that had become my sanctuary. Somewhere out there, Nathan was unraveling, his carefully constructed world falling apart. Every question from a client, every reopened police case, every news story about mysterious deaths was another crack in his facade. 6 weeks into our campaign to unravel Nathan's world, everything changed. I was reviewing case files in the cabin when Sophie arrived unannounced, her face tense with urgent news. Nathan's cracking, she said, pulling out her laptop. Really cracking. Watch this. She played a video from a Boston news station. Nathan was giving what was supposed to be a routine statement about the ongoing search for my body, but something was different. The polished, grief-stricken widower act had slipped. My wife's body is out there, he was saying, his voice rising unnaturally. She has to be out there, and I won't rest until... He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes darting wildly. The reporter tried to ask another question, but Nathan suddenly turned and walked off camera, leaving the bewildered news team filming his retreat. That was yesterday, Sophie said. Today, he missed 3 critical client meetings. Megan says he's been locked in his office making frantic calls. The facade is crumbling. The pressure we'd carefully orchestrated was finally taking its toll. The state financial audit had uncovered serious irregularities. 3 of his biggest clients had withdrawn their investments. Detective Rivera had officially reopened the investigations into Elizabeth Carter and Jennifer Walsh's deaths. But here's the real breaking point, Sophie continued, pulling up an email on her screen. Megan intercepted this. Nathan's partners are cutting ties with him. They're trying to distance themselves before everything collapses. I read the email, a carefully worded legal document from Thomas Whitman and the other senior partners. Removing Nathan from all decision-making positions, pending resolution of certain inquiries. They were abandoning him, protecting themselves. He's always been able to maintain control by having a perfect plan, I said, understanding the significance. But now everything's falling apart at once, and he can't stop it. Sophie nodded grimly. Rivera thinks he's getting ready to run. There's been movement in his offshore accounts, inquiries about private flights to non-extradition countries. We need to move fast. We had prepared for this moment. Over the past weeks, we'd built an airtight case, financial records proving fraud, evidence linking him to multiple suspicious deaths, testimony from witnesses who'd seen signs of his abuse. But we needed him to break publicly, to reveal his true nature where everyone could see it. What about the other families? I asked. Are they ready? They're all in position. Elizabeth's parents have scheduled a press conference for tomorrow, demanding a new investigation into their daughter's death. Jennifer's sister is going public with evidence she's been gathering for years. Maria's brother has hired a high-profile attorney to file wrongful death charges. The next part of our plan was the riskiest, but also the most crucial. Detective Rivera would bring Nathan in for questioning, not about my death, but about the financial irregularities. It would seem routine, just another headache in his increasingly complicated life. Once he's in the interview room, Sophie explained, Rivera will start connecting the dots. The financial fraud, the pattern of suspicious deaths, the inconsistencies in his story about my accident. Nathan's perfect plan will be exposed piece by piece. And when he breaks? I asked, though I already knew the answer. We'll be ready. Every word will be recorded, every reaction documented. And when he finally snaps, because we both know he will, it won't be in private where he can control the narrative. It will be on record, impossible to deny. Looking at my evidence, bored, now crowded with photos, documents, and connections, I felt a strange mix of emotions. The woman Nathan had tried to kill, the afraid, controlled version of myself, seemed like a stranger now. There's one more thing, Sophie said, hesitantly. Rivera thinks we should consider having you there. My heart stopped. At the station? Not in the room, but nearby, where you could be brought in at the crucial moment. Seeing you alive, knowing his perfect murder wasn't perfect after all. It might be what finally makes him snap completely. The thought of facing Nathan again made my hands shake, but not from fear this time. When? Tomorrow morning. Rivera's bringing him in at 9. Sophie watched me carefully. Are you sure you're ready for this? Once we start, there's no going back. I walked to the cabin window, looking at my reflection. Dark hair had grown out, showing blonde roots, physical evidence of the two versions of myself. The scared wife who had fallen from the waterfall and the survivor who had risen from that fatal plunge. I'm ready, I said firmly. Nathan thought he could erase me, use my death to cover his crimes. Instead, he created someone stronger, someone who's going to bring his whole world crashing down. The Boston Police Department looked exactly as I remembered it from the outside. A stark brick building that I used to pass daily on my way to the museum. But now, sitting in Detective Rivera's unmarked car across the street, it felt like the stage for the final act of a play Nathan hadn't known he was starring in. Nathan arrived 10 minutes ago, Rivera said, checking his phone. Right now, he thinks this is just routine questioning about some financial discrepancies. Standard procedure. The detective had a calm, steady presence that helped settle my nerves. Are you ready for this? I nodded, touching my dark hair, now showing distinct blonde roots. One last time. Sophie sat beside me in the back, seat, squeezing my hand. We watched as Thomas Whitman, Nathan's former partner, hurried up the police station steps. "Right on schedule," Sophie murmured. "Whitman's about to throw Nathan under the bus to save himself." The plan was precisely choreographed. First, Rivera would question Nathan about the financial fraud, just enough to get him defensive. Then, Whitman would arrive, allegedly to help, but actually to save himself by revealing details about their scheme. Finally, when Nathan was sufficiently rattled, Rivera would begin asking about the pattern of deaths: Elizabeth, Maria, Jennifer, and me. "Remember," Rivera said, "you only come in if I give the signal. We need his confession first. Everything else is just building pressure." Inside the station, I was led to a small observation room adjacent to the interrogation room. Through the one-way glass, I could see Nathan for the first time since the falls. He looked smaller somehow, less intimidating. His usual impeccable appearance showed signs of strain. His shirt slightly wrinkled, his hair not perfectly styled. Rivera entered the interrogation room, carrying a thick file. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Phillips. We just have some questions about certain financial transactions." Nathan's response was pure muscle memory, the charming, confident smile, the relaxed posture. "Of course, detective. Always happy to help the police. Especially after everything." He managed to make his voice crack slightly on the last word. Ever the performer. But as Rivera began laying out documents, asking increasingly specific questions about suspicious transfers and missing client funds, Nathan's facade began to crack. His answers became shorter, his smile more forced. When Whitman was brought in, allegedly to clarify some details, Nathan's face showed the first flash of real fear. "Mr. Whitman," Rivera said, "could you explain these transfers? The ones made the day after Mrs. Phillips's accident?" Whitman didn't look at Nathan. "Those were unauthorized transactions. Nathan acted alone. The firm had no knowledge." "You lying bastard!" Nathan's explosion was sudden, his fist slamming onto the table. "We planned this together, all of it." "Planned what, exactly?" Rivera asked quietly. Nathan caught himself, but too late. The mask of grieving widower slipped back on, but now it fit poorly, like cheap Halloween costume. I meant the investment strategy, of course, nothing more." Rivera began laying out photographs: Elizabeth, Maria, Jennifer, me. "Interesting pattern here, Mr. Phillips." My blood ran cold. "Are they safe?" "Rivera's got people watching their farm, but this is good, actually. It means Nathan's starting to doubt himself, starting to wonder if his perfect murder wasn't so perfect after all." I walked to the cabin, window, looking out at the Maine forest that had become my sanctuary. Somewhere out there, Nathan was unraveling, his carefully constructed world falling apart. Every question from a client, every reopened police case, every news story about mysterious deaths was another crack in his facade. 6 weeks into our campaign to unravel Nathan's world, everything changed. I was reviewing case files in the cabin when Sophie arrived unannounced, her face tense with urgent news. "Nathan's cracking," she said, pulling out her laptop. "Really cracking. Watch this." She played a video from a Boston news station. Nathan was giving what was supposed to be a routine statement about the ongoing search for my body, but something was different. The polished, grief-stricken widower act had slipped. "My wife's body is out there," he was saying, his voice rising unnaturally. "She has to be out there, and I won't rest until—" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes darting wildly. The reporter tried to ask another question, but Nathan suddenly turned and walked off camera, leaving the bewildered news team filming his retreat. "That was yesterday," Sophie said. "Today he missed 3 critical client meetings. Megan says he's been locked in his office, making frantic calls. The facade is crumbling. The pressure we'd carefully orchestrated was finally taking its toll. The state financial audit had uncovered serious irregularities. 3 of his biggest clients had withdrawn their investments. Detective Rivera had officially reopened the investigations into Elizabeth Carter and Jennifer Walsh's deaths. But here's the real breaking point, Sophie continued, pulling up an email on her screen. Megan intercepted this. Nathan's partners are cutting ties with him. They're trying to distance themselves before everything collapses. I read the email, a carefully worded legal document from Thomas Whitman and the other senior partners, removing Nathan from all decision-making positions, pending resolution of certain inquiries. They were abandoning him, protecting themselves. He's always been able to maintain control by having a perfect plan, I said, understanding the significance. But now everything's falling apart at once, and he can't stop it. Sophie nodded grimly. Rivera thinks he's getting ready to run. There's been movement in his offshore accounts, inquiries about private flights to non-extradition countries. We need to move fast. We had prepared for this moment. Over the past weeks, we'd built an airtight case, financial records proving fraud, evidence linking him to multiple suspicious deaths, testimony from witnesses who'd seen signs of his abuse. But we needed him to break publicly, to reveal his true nature where everyone could see it. What about the other families? I asked. Are they ready? They're all in position. Elizabeth's parents have scheduled a press conference for tomorrow, demanding a new investigation into their daughter's death. Jennifer's sister is going public with evidence she's been gathering for years. Maria's brother has hired a high-profile attorney to file wrongful death charges. The next part of our plan was the riskiest, but also the most crucial. Detective Rivera would bring Nathan in for questioning, not about my death, but about the financial irregularities. It would seem routine, just another headache in his increasingly complicated life. Once he's in the interview room, Sophie explained, Rivera will start connecting the dots. The financial fraud, the pattern of suspicious deaths, the inconsistencies in his story about my accident. Nathan's perfect plan will be exposed piece by piece. And when he breaks? I asked, though I already knew the answer. We'll be ready. Every word will be recorded, every reaction documented. And when he finally snaps, because we both know he will, it won't be in private where he can control the narrative. It will be on record, impossible to deny. Looking at my evidence board, now crowded with photos, documents, and connections, I felt a strange mix of emotions. The woman Nathan had tried to kill, the afraid, controlled version of myself, seemed like a stranger now. There's one more thing, Sophie said hesitantly. Rivera thinks we should consider having you there. My heart stopped. At the station? Not in the room, but nearby, where you could be brought in at the crucial moment. Seeing you alive, knowing his perfect murder wasn't perfect after all, it might be what finally makes him snap completely. The thought of facing Nathan again made my hands shake, but not from fear this time. When? Tomorrow morning. Rivera's bringing him in at 9. Sophie watched me carefully. Are you sure you're ready for this? Once we start, there's no going back. I walked to the cabin window, looking at my reflection. Dark hair had grown out, showing blonde roots, physical evidence of the 2 versions of myself. The scared wife who had fallen from the waterfall, and the survivor who had risen from that fatal plunge. I'm ready, I said firmly. Nathan thought he could erase me, use my death to cover his crimes. Instead, he created someone stronger, someone who's going to bring his whole world crashing down. The Boston Police Department looked exactly as I remembered it from the outside, a stark brick building that I used to pass daily on my way to the museum. But now, sitting in Detective Rivera's unmarked car across the street, it felt like the stage for the final act of a play Nathan hadn't known he was starring in. Nathan arrived 10 minutes ago, Rivera said, checking his phone. Right now, he thinks this is just routine questioning about some financial discrepancies. Standard procedure. The detective had a calm, steady presence that helped settle my nerves. Are you ready for this? I nodded, touching my dark hair, now showing distinct blonde roots, one last time. Sophie sat beside me in the back seat, squeezing my hand. We watched as Thomas Whitman, Nathan's former partner, hurried up the police station steps. Right on schedule, Sophie murmured. Whitman's about to throw Nathan under the bus to save himself. The plan was precisely choreographed. First, Rivera would question Nathan about the financial fraud. Just enough to get him defensive. Then Whitman would arrive, allegedly to help, but actually to save himself by revealing details about their scheme. Finally, when Nathan was sufficiently rattled, Rivera would begin asking about the pattern of deaths. Elizabeth, Maria, Jennifer, and me. Remember, Rivera said, you only come in if I give the signal. We need his confession first. Everything else is just building pressure. Inside the station, I was led to a small observation room adjacent to the interrogation room. Through the one-way glass, I could see Nathan for the first time since the falls. He looked smaller somehow, less intimidating. His usual impeccable appearance showed signs of strain, his shirt slightly wrinkled, his hair not perfectly styled. Rivera entered the interrogation room, carrying a thick file. Thank you for coming in, Mr. Phillips. We just have some questions about certain financial transactions. Nathan's response was pure muscle memory, the charming, confident smile, the relaxed posture. Of course, Detective. Always happy to help the police, especially after everything. He managed to make his voice crack slightly on the last word. Ever, the performer. But as Rivera began laying out documents, asking increasingly specific questions about suspicious transfers and missing client funds, Nathan's facade began to crack. His answers became shorter, his smile more forced. When Whitman was brought in, allegedly to clarify some details, Nathan's face showed the first flash of real fear. Mr. Whitman, Rivera said, could you explain these transfers? The ones made the day after Mrs. Phillips's accident? Whitman didn't look at Nathan. Those were unauthorized transactions. Nathan acted alone. The firm had no knowledge. You lying bastard. Nathan's explosion was sudden, his fist slamming onto the table. We planned this together, all of it. Planned what, exactly? Rivera asked quietly. Nathan caught himself, but too late. The mask of grieving widower slipped back on, but now it fit poorly, like cheap Halloween costume. I meant the investment strategy, of course, nothing more. Rivera began laying out photographs. Elizabeth, Maria, Jennifer, me. Interesting pattern here, Mr. Phillips. All these women, all these accidents, all these conveniently timed financial transactions. I don't know what you're implying, Nathan said, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. His eyes kept darting to the door, like a trapped animal, seeking escape. Your wife was documenting the abuse, wasn't she? Rivera continued. We found her cloud account. The photos, the recordings, the journal entries. She was building a case. Nathan's face went completely still. A stillness I recognized from our marriage, usually right before his worst explosions of rage. My wife died in a tragic accident. I tried to save her. Did you? Like you tried to save the others? Elizabeth, on the mountain trail, Maria on the sailboat, Jennifer at the bridge. You can't prove anything, Nathan snarled, his charming mask completely gone now. You have no bodies, no evidence, nothing. Rivera leaned forward. That's not entirely true. You see, Nathan, can I call you Nathan? Someone survived. Someone who can testify to exactly what happened at Silver Mist Falls. Nathan's laugh was ugly, unhinged. Survived? I watched her fall. I watched her hit the water. I watched. He stopped abruptly, realizing what he'd just admitted. That was the signal. The door to the interrogation room opened, and I walked. Hello, Nathan. The sound he made was inhuman, a strangled gasp of shock and rage. He lunged across the table, all pretense forgotten, hands reaching for my throat. But Rivera and another officer were ready, restraining him as he screamed, "You're dead! I killed you! I watched you die!" Every word was another nail in his coffin, every scream another confession caught on camera. As they dragged him from the room, still raving about how he had killed me, how he had killed all of them, I remained standing there, silent and strong. Nathan's public breakdown made headlines across the country. "Murdered wife returns from the dead, exposing serial killer's financial empire," screamed the Boston Globe. Video clips of his confession went viral, the composed investment banker transforming into a raging monster the moment he saw me alive, confessing to multiple murders in his fury at being outsmarted. The days following his arrest were a whirlwind. I sat with Detective Rivera for hours, giving my official statement, finally telling the full story of the abuse, the manipulation, and that final day at Silver Mist Falls. Sophie was there throughout, both as my lawyer and my friend, ensuring every detail was properly documented. But the most powerful moments came when I met the families of Nathan's other victims. Elizabeth Carter's parents, Maria Suarez's brother, Jennifer Walsh's sister. They all came to Boston after Nathan's arrest. We gathered in a private room at the police station, sharing stories, connecting pieces of a puzzle that had haunted them for years. "She started acting different after they married," Elizabeth's mother said, tears in her eyes. More withdrawn. She'd cancel plans at the last minute, always with some excuse about Nathan needing her for something. Maria's brother nodded. Same with Maria. The smart, confident woman we knew just disappeared, like he was slowly erasing her even before he couldn't finish the sentence. Jennifer's sister reached across the table and took my hand. "But you survived. You're here to tell the truth, to make sure he can't hurt anyone else." The investigation that followed uncovered the full scope of Nathan's crimes. The financial fraud was even bigger than we'd suspected. Nearly $50 million stolen from clients, laundered through a complex web of offshore accounts. Nathan and his partners had been using the deaths of his wives to cover massive thefts, timing the fraudulent transfers to coincide with the chaos and sympathy surrounding each tragic accident. Thomas Whitman and two other partners turned state's evidence, providing detailed testimonies about the financial schemes in exchange for lighter sentences. Their statements, combined with Megan Chen's meticulous documentation and my testimony, built an airtight case. "He's never getting out," Sophie told me as we watched the news coverage of Nathan's indictment. The fraud charges alone carry decades of prison time. Add multiple counts of attempted murder, actual murder once they find the other bodies. He's done. The case sparked a national conversation about domestic violence in wealthy, seemingly perfect marriages. I found myself being asked to speak at conferences, to share my story with other survivors. Each time I spoke, more women would come forward, with their own stories of abuse hidden behind facades of privilege and success. Earl and Martha drove down from their farm for the preliminary hearing. Martha hugged me tightly, whispering, "Look how far you've come from that half-drowned girl who showed up in our kitchen." Earl, ever practical, had already helped Detective Rivera locate several promising sites to search for the remains of Nathan's other victims. His law enforcement background and knowledge of the area proved invaluable as the investigation continued. 1 month after Nathan's arrest, I stood once, again at Silver Mist Falls. Sophie had thought I was crazy to want to return, but I needed this. Needed to reclaim this place that had been meant to be the site of my murder. The roar of the falls was just as I remembered, but it no longer filled me with terror. Instead, I felt a strange sense of peace. The woman Nathan had tried to kill, here was gone in a way. But someone stronger had survived that plunge, someone who had turned his perfect murder plot into his ultimate downfall. "Ready to go?" Sophie asked gently, standing a respectful distance behind me. I took one last look at the falls, at the spot where Nathan had pushed me. "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." Back in Boston, I had decisions to make. The museum had offered me my old curator position back, but I wasn't sure I wanted to return to my old life. The woman who had survived the falls, who had helped bring down a killer and expose a massive fraud, had different dreams now. 3 months after Nathan's arrest, I sat in a small cafe in downtown Boston, my now shoulder-length hair returned to its natural blonde. Across from me sat Catherine Martinez, a journalist from the New York Times who was writing an in-depth piece about domestic violence among the wealthy elite. "Your story has become a wake-up call," she said, taking notes as we talked. Since Nathan's arrest, domestic violence hotlines have reported a 40% increase in calls from women in high-income brackets, women who, like you, seem to have perfect lives from the outside. I stirred my coffee. Actual cream and sugar. Now, not the black coffee Nathan had insisted I drink to watch my weight. Little acts of freedom like this still felt revolutionary. "That's why I agreed to this interview," I told her. "Because there are so many women trapped behind perfect facades, thinking they're alone, thinking no one will believe them because their husbands are respected businessmen, doctors, lawyers." The article would be part of a larger project I'd been working on. With Sophie's help, I'd established a foundation called Phoenix Rising, dedicated to helping wealthy abuse victims who often fell through the cracks of traditional support systems. Women whose abusers had the resources to hire expensive lawyers, private investigators, and PR firms to maintain their spotless reputations. "The foundation's first shelter opens next month," I explained to Catherine. "It's designed specifically for high-risk cases, women whose abusers have the means and connections to track them down. We provide not just physical safety, but legal support, financial planning, and help documenting abuse for future court cases." The idea had come from my own experience and from meeting other survivors. Women like Rachel Green, whose CEO husband had hired private detectives to stalk her when she tried to leave, or Diana Chen, whose surgeon spouse had used his hospital connections to track her through medical records. These women needed more than traditional shelters could offer. "And you're funding this through the recovered money from Nathan's fraud scheme?" Catherine asked. I nodded. The court awarded significant restitution to his victims' families. They all chose to donate portions to the foundation. It felt right, using Nathan's stolen money to help the very kind of women he targeted. Elizabeth's parents had been particularly supportive, turning their daughter's tragedy into hope for others. They'd become regular speakers at foundation events, helping other parents recognize signs of abuse in their children's seemingly perfect relationships. The foundation was only part of my new life. I'd also been working with Detective Rivera, developing training programs for law enforcement on recognizing sophisticated domestic abuse, the kind hidden behind wealth and social status. My experience helping expose Nathan's financial crimes had revealed how often abusers used economic manipulation as a weapon. "What about the museum?" Catherine asked. "Do you miss curating?" I smiled, thinking of my old life organizing exhibitions and managing collections. Art will always be part of who I am, but I found a different way to use those skills. Next month, we're opening an exhibition at the foundation. Artwork by abuse survivors, telling their stories through creative expression. The exhibition had been Martha's idea, actually. She'd started sending me paintings done by women who stayed at her farm, each one a raw, powerful testimony to survival. Now, artists from across the country were contributing works, turning trauma into triumph. My phone buzzed, a message from Sophie about Nathan's latest appeal being denied. His lawyers had tried claiming his confession was coerced, but the video of his unhinged reaction to seeing me alive had made that argument impossible to sustain. "He'll die in prison," I told Catherine. But more importantly, his case has helped expose how abusers use wealth and social status to hide their crimes. 3 other cases have been reopened based on similarities to Nathan's pattern. As we wrapped up the interview, Catherine asked one final question. "What would you say to women who are where you were a year ago? Trapped in seemingly perfect marriages, afraid to speak out?" I thought carefully before answering. I'd tell them that the scariest moment, whether it's falling from a waterfall or walking out your front door, isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning. There are people ready to help, to believe you, to fight alongside you. You just have to take that first step. 6 months after Nathan's arrest, I stood on a stage at a national domestic violence conference in Washington, D.C., looking out at the sea of faces, survivors, advocates, law enforcement officers, and mental health professionals. I saw both pain and hope reflected back at me. "A year ago," I began, "I was supposed to die at Silver Mist Falls. My husband had planned it perfectly. The grieving widower act, the financial cover-up, the carefully crafted accident scene. But he made one crucial mistake. He underestimated the strength of the woman he was trying to destroy." The Phoenix Rising Foundation had grown beyond my wildest expectations. What had started as a single shelter in Boston had expanded to 3 locations across New England. Each facility was designed with high-security protocols and sophisticated protection measures, acknowledging the unique challenges faced by women fleeing wealthy, well-connected abusers. Our latest initiative, I explained to the audience, focuses on financial abuse, recognition, and prevention. Many of our clients are women who, like me, had successful careers before marriage, but were gradually cut off from their financial independence. Their abusers used family wealth, social status, and business connections as weapons of control. Working with forensic accountants and legal experts, we developed programs to help women document financial abuse and hidden assets. The skills I'd gained while investigating Nathan's fraud had proved invaluable in understanding how abusers used complex financial schemes to maintain control. After my speech, a young woman approached me. Her hands were shaking as she introduced herself as Amanda, a corporate lawyer whose investment banker husband had been systematically isolating her from her family and career. "I saw myself in your story," she whispered. "The gradual control, the perfect public image, the way he uses his connections to monitor my every move. I've been afraid to leave because I thought no one would believe me. He's on the hospital board. He chairs charity committees. Everyone thinks he's perfect." I took her hand and led her to Sophie, who was already pulling out her notebook. Another woman finding her way to freedom, another life that wouldn't end at the bottom of a metaphorical waterfall. Later that evening, I had dinner with Earl and Martha, who had flown in for the conference. Martha had become something of a legend in survivor support circles, her farm now an official safe house in our network. Earl's law enforcement background had proved invaluable in developing security protocols for our shelters. 4 women came to us last month, Martha reported, her eyes bright with purpose. All of them reminded me of you that first day, scared, confused, but with that spark of strength just waiting to be fanned into flame. Earl added, "And that detective training program you developed with Rivera is making a difference. Police are starting to look deeper when wealthy, prominent men report their wives' accidents or suicides." The program had already helped identify 2 cases similar to Nathan's, wealthy men with suspicious spousal deaths in their past. Both cases were under investigation, the pattern now impossible to ignore thanks to the precedent of Nathan's case. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. Another appeal from Nathan's lawyers had been rejected. He was trying to claim mental illness now, arguing that his confession was the result of a psychotic break. But the financial evidence, the pattern of deaths, and the meticulous planning proved otherwise. He was exactly what I'd said he was, a calculating killer who had finally been outsmarted by one of his intended victims. "Your sister called," Martha mentioned as we finished dinner. "She's doing well with her survivor support group." Kate had turned her own grief and anger into action, starting a support group for families of domestic violence victims. The group helped families recognize signs of abuse in their loved ones' relationships and provided guidance on how to help without putting the victim at greater risk. After dinner, I returned to my hotel room and stood at the window, looking out over the capital city. A year ago, I had been standing at another window, in a cabin in Maine, hiding from the man who had tried to kill me. Now I was helping other women find their own strength, their own path to freedom. My phone buzzed again, a message from Detective Rivera. They had found Jennifer Walsh's remains, exactly where Nathan had finally revealed they would be. Her sister could finally lay her to rest properly. It wasn't justice, not really, but it was closure of a sort. 1 year to the day after Nathan had tried to end my life at Silver Mist Falls, I stood there again. But this time, I wasn't alone. Behind me stood 24 women, all survivors who had found their way to Phoenix Rising over the past year. We had chosen this place, the site of what was meant to be my murder, for something powerful, the first annual Survivors Summit. "This is where my story was supposed to end," I told the gathered group. The roar of the falls provided a backdrop to my words, but it no longer sounded threatening. Instead, it felt like nature's applause. Instead, it became where my real story began. Among the group was Amanda, the corporate lawyer I'd met at the conference. She had left her abusive husband 3 months ago, with our foundation's help. Now she was one of our legal advisors, helping other women navigate the complex intersection of wealth, power, and domestic violence. "Each of us has our own waterfall," I continued, looking at these strong women who had refused to become victims. That moment when we had to choose between dying, either literally or spiritually, and fighting back. We chose to fight. The summit was more than just a symbolic gathering. We had assembled experts in law enforcement, financial forensics, legal advocacy, and trauma recovery. Over the next 3 days, we would share strategies, strengthen our network, and plan the foundation's expansion. Sophie, standing beside me, squeezed my hand. In the past year, she had helped dozens of women build cases against their abusers, using the template we had created to bring down Nathan. Her law firm now had a dedicated division for domestic violence cases involving high-net-worth abusers. "The latest statistics just came in," she whispered to me. "Reports of domestic violence among upper-income households have increased by 60% since Nathan's case went public. Not because there's more abuse, but because more women are coming forward. They're not buying the perfect marriage facade anymore." Earl and Martha had come too, of course. Their farm had become a crucial first stop for many women in our network, a place to catch their breath and find their strength before taking the next steps toward freedom. Martha's practical wisdom and Earl's protective instincts had saved countless lives. "Look who made it," Sophie nodded toward the parking lot, where Detective Rivera was helping Elizabeth Carter's parents from their car. The elderly couple had become passionate advocates, speaking at police training sessions about recognizing signs of abuse in wealthy families. Their daughter's death had helped create a template for identifying similar cases. The summit's first session would focus on financial abuse recognition and prevention. Megan Chen, who had been crucial in exposing Nathan's crimes, was leading this section. She had developed a comprehensive guide to identifying and documenting financial control tactics used by wealthy abusers. "We've identified 3 more cases, matching Nathan's pattern," Rivera told me quietly during a break. "Men who used their wealth and social status to hide domestic violence, then arranged convenient accidents for their wives. Without your case breaking the pattern, we might never have seen the connection." Nathan's case had become a landmark in domestic violence jurisprudence. His conviction had set precedents for how evidence of financial abuse could be used to support domestic violence cases. The video of his confession, his mask of respectability, shattering at the sight of the wife he thought he had killed, was now used in training sessions worldwide. As the sun began to set over Silver Mist Falls, we gathered for a ceremony of remembrance and hope. Each woman held a candle, and as they shared their stories, they lit their candles from each other's flames, a literal representation of how survival stories spark hope in others. A year ago, I stood at the edge of these falls, thinking my life was over, I said, holding my own candle. Nathan thought he was writing my ending. Instead, he wrote his own. Every woman he tried to silence, every life he tried to end, became part of the evidence that finally brought him down. Looking at these strong, resilient women illuminated by candlelight, I felt something I hadn't expected. Gratitude. Not for what Nathan had done, never that, but for what had risen from his attempt to destroy me. Every woman here represented a life saved, a cycle broken, a future reclaimed. As twilight deepened over Silver Mist Falls, each survivor's candle created a constellation of light around the place where my story had nearly ended. The falls that had been meant to silence me forever now witnessed a chorus of voices, each sharing their journey from victim to survivor to advocate. When I started Phoenix Rising, I addressed the group, I thought it would be about helping women escape, but it's become so much more than that. It's about transforming pain into power, fear into freedom, and silence into strength. In the year since Nathan's arrest, the Foundation had helped over 200 women escape dangerous situations. Each case was unique, but the pattern was familiar. Successful women trapped in seemingly perfect marriages, their independence slowly eroded by wealthy, controlling partners who used their social status as a shield for abuse. The Foundation's work had expanded beyond direct intervention. We now had research partnerships with 3 major universities, studying the intersection of wealth, power, and domestic violence. Our findings were reshaping how law enforcement and social services approached cases involving high-net-worth abusers. "Rebecca!" Amanda called out, stepping forward with tears in her eyes. "I need to share something." She took a deep breath, her candle flame flickering. "Yesterday, my sister finally left her husband. Seeing me rebuild my life gave her the courage to save her own. That's what this is all about. Each survivor becoming a lighthouse for others." Martha, who had been quietly listening to the stories, added her own wisdom. "When Rebecca showed up at our farm that day, soaking wet and terrified, I saw something. In her eyes, not just fear but determination. That same light is in all of you now." The success stories were mounting. Diana Chen, whose surgeon husband had used his hospital connections to stalk her, was now running our medical advocacy program, helping other women navigate healthcare privacy issues. Rachel Green, once terrorized by private investigators hired by her CEO husband, had become our security consultant, turning her experience into expertise that protected others. Sophie stepped forward, her legal papers illuminated by candlelight. "I have some news to share," she announced. "The governor just signed the Phoenix Act into law. It extends the statute of limitations for domestic violence cases and requires courts to consider patterns of coercive control in wealthy marriages. Nathan's case was the catalyst, but your stories, all of your stories, made it happen. The law would make it easier for women to prove non-physical abuse, particularly the financial and social control tactics favored by wealthy abusers. It also created special protections for victims whose abusers had the resources to hire private investigators or manipulate the legal system." Detective Rivera, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the group, spoke up. "Thanks to the evidence gathering protocols we developed through Rebecca's case, we've secured convictions in 2 similar cases this year. The perfect husband facade doesn't work anymore. We know what to look for now." Earl cleared his throat, his weathered face emotional in the candlelight. My old police buddies used to say domestic violence was hardest to spot in wealthy neighborhoods. Everyone looked so perfect from the outside. But thanks to you ladies, that's changing. You're saving lives by telling your stories. As night fell completely, we performed our final ceremony. Each woman wrote down what she had lost on a piece of paper, not just material things, but the pieces of themselves their abusers had tried to steal. Then, one by one, they tore up these papers and let the pieces float away on the wind. This isn't about forgetting, I explained as I tore up my own paper. It's about transforming. Every piece of us they tried to destroy becomes part of our strength, our wisdom, our ability to help others. Looking at these strong, resilient women, I thought about the Rebecca who had fallen from these falls a year ago. She had died here, in a way. But what had risen in her place was something more powerful than Nathan could have imagined. Not just one survivor, but a movement. Our stories don't end at the bottom of the waterfall, I concluded, raising my candle high. They begin there. Every woman who escapes, every life saved, every abuser exposed, is part of our collective rising. We are not victims of our past, we are architects of our future. The candlelight reflected off the falls, creating a shimmer of hope in the darkness. These waters that had been meant to end my story had instead become a source of rebirth for so many. Nathan had wanted to silence one voice forever. Instead, he had awakened a chorus of voices that would never be silenced again. As we gathered for one final photograph, a group of survivors turned warriors, our candles bright against the night sky, I felt a deep sense of completion. The journey that had begun with my fall from these falls had come full circle. But this wasn't an ending. It was a continuation, a passing of the torch to each woman who would find her way to freedom, each survivor who would become a beacon of hope for others. The falls roared their eternal song, but now it sounded different, to all of us. Not a dirge of death, but an anthem of survival, of transformation, of hope that could never be extinguished.